welcome back to Hermetic Link. I am Jorius,
My name is Silas.
and today we're going to be talking about the life and light that comes after death and destruction, the kind of order that comes out of the chaos of war, and that's morality.
Yeah, so last episode we spoke about apocalypse, and I had alluded to something before shortly learning that it was a lot more literal than I thought. So I said that in the themes of apocalypse and in apocalypse narratives, there's always this common understanding of the events that implies that humanity receives information which it was not previously prepared for, where you could say that God had not yet given permission for these things to be said, which is why, during the time of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and even with the introduction of the Old Testament as it was being made, humanity came to revelations that required them to change their perspective of the world around them, of their morality, and how they should govern themselves. And this didn't just change once, it happens every time one of these ages comes to its end or its death. Um, well, the word apocalypse in Greek literally just means revelation. So that was more literal than what I was originally privy to when we first did that episode. So the point stands um, even more.
Yeah, so this episode is going to be a lesson in perspective and necessity. We're going to have to explore why people made gods and made mythology and pantheons in general. Why people made order, morality, and justice, because understanding these things gets us closer to the divine. There's this Voltaire quote that applies to this. If there were no God, it would be necessary to make him.
I think this is the time to do that. So this overlaps. This is somebody from a while ago saying that what is alluded to today with philosophers like Nietzsche, who say that God is dead. And so, what those philosophers and all those related to that line of thought will tell you is that what is now required is that you must invent a guiding force of your own. This doesn't necessarily need to be God. Nietzsche says that it shouldn't be God. Um, but the lesson there is, well, we have to come to grips with the idea of our laws changing. So I said before that we are kind of at the end of an age. They call it the end of times, not the end of life. Um, and the coming apocalypse is a revelation. I think it's a pretty sound estimation to say that we are having to completely rewire our own minds and how we are going to guide ourselves from here on out so that we can maintain a civilization and so that we can maintain order.
There's a lot of overlap between, uh, or maybe I shouldn't say a lot of overlap, but there's some overlap between Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, the Overman, and Aleister Crowley's, uh, I believe it was his motto, "Do as thou wilt." There's the common message in that is supposed to be essentially developing your own version of the holy guardian angel, or like a conduit for the holy guardian angel to talk to you through.
So I think a fair question to ask when you're starting is, well, do magicians who are going through alchemic and hermeneutic processes, do they reject God or do they still remain faithful? I mean, this is a question that they ask themselves all the time, and that they're very much accused of all manner of heresies. Like, you have rejected our God. Why are you spreading this heresy? When the truth is, it really has more to do with gnosis and knowledge than it does rejecting or accepting anything. And I'm sure we'll go more into that as the episode plays out. About, do you even need to replace God? In my opinion, it's yes, but no.
Yeah, I think the question is, what should you replace God with? Because the message is that we have killed God. What should be in his place?
Well, I think the
And
people that ask, oh, sorry, go on.
the 19th century and like Enlightenment era answer to what should go in God's place was the natural sciences.
I think, well, another theme in Nietzsche's philosophy, and something that ended up getting mulled over for a very long time after that, to some extent still is religion is about reconciling or outright rejecting a person's own will to power. So your will to power could be engaging with the natural sciences. Maybe that is what should take that place. But this is kind of allegorically similar to having a more Eastern style of thought, a more Taoist style of thought. And what these philosophers don't take into account a lot of the time, I'm not going to say all of them do, because that Aleister Crowley quote, "Do as thou wilt." Um, well, Crowley ended his life with a very Eastern mindset, but Crowley was also a lot of people, um, and he changed his own philosophies and his own methods quite a lot. So to ask this question and to panic internally about what should your guiding force be, well, I would turn philosophically to the East, because this obsession that our idea of a guiding force has died is already more or less answered by uh, ancient China, ancient Japan, who had already reconciled their will to power, and who didn't necessarily outsource their morality to another divine force. Although that's still present, just not to the extent that it is in Abrahamic religions. Because I think as time goes on, Abrahamic religion being a very recent invention in the terms of human history, well, the questions that we're asking now about what should take its place, or if anything should take its place, I think rather how we should think of that dilemma is that the way that these theologies were used was to either suppress or to channel everyone's, a large population's will to power. And this is one of those things where it's like humanity existed a long time before that invention, and they will probably exist a long time after that invention, after coming to peace with it as well. It's one of those things that ended up robbed isn't the right word, but these are questions that we wouldn't really be having trouble with otherwise, were it not for the introduction of central morality coming from one authority. that tells you what to do and gives you very specific directions and punishes you if you do not follow them.
You know, I think something interesting from the rational tradition, going back to Socrates, was that I think he was monotheist in a time where like pantheism
Hmm.
was the norm. The god Socrates probably wanted to gesture towards most was divine rationale.
Hmm. I actually know about he called this theos and was in regular dialogue with it throughout his entire life. This one force, which he referred to as the source of all creation.
Yes, they
Um,
even coined a term for people with the mark of the daimon.
hmm Yeah,
Right.
it was a very niche kind of belief, uh, but it guided him in ways. It was the thing that told him not to resist the death sentence. Like when his time came, he was like, "Well, I'm already old. I could run away from Athens." That voice in his head, Theos, the daimon, said, "No, don't do it." And he just listened to it. He was like, "Oh, well, okay. Who are you reading about now? You're reading about Socrates and his ideas." And the people who executed him got remembered for nothing else besides the fact that they were corrupt and that they killed Socrates. Sounds like pretty sound judgment on the Theos's part to me. So I think partly that answers the question. To finish, that this also alludes to like, do philosophers or people who struggle with these questions reject God, or do they replace him, or do they need him at all? Well, here's Socrates in a time of polytheism, specifically referring to himself as being in conversation with the daimon. And well, that'll probably come up later too.
Yeah, we'll probably have to circle back around to that. So I wanted to talk about the four horsemen:
Hmm.
war, pestilence, famine, and death. These are symptoms of perceived apocalypse,
Yeah.
and these symptoms will repeat in various stages um, over the course of history. The Book of Judges, if you know that book, goes into that sort of vicious uh, negative feedback loop.
Yep.
So after developing past a certain point, the people will gain hubris and start to sin, which leads to decadence, and then that will lead to collapse, and then that can be perceived as the apocalypse.
So I think what we were talking about before we started recording is that these four horsemen of the apocalypse, being war, pestilence, death, and famine. Well, you put it in terms of like natural disasters paired with war, and it's like humanity can handle one of these things at a time. You know, like if humanity's at war, it's at war. It's like whatever. You know, like just another Tuesday. It's when these horsemen of the apocalypse start to uh, overlap in time that people really start freaking out and they start perceiving it as apocalypse. Like if war and famine are happening at the same time, you know, people's alarm bells start going off. If war, pestilence, and famine are happening, then they start really freaking out. War, pestilence, death, and famine at a severe enough level, people will really start thinking that it's the apocalypse. I mean, I think you only need to turn to not to not to inject modern politics into this at all, but I don't think it's a very controversial thing to say that because of our own ignorance and because of our mishandling of situations, we kind of proved ourselves as not able to handle what, all things considered, are very natural events to happen. I mean, pestilence happens, as horrible as it is. War is mankind's own sin. But what we proved through this time was that our ways of working and our ways of responding to these situations are too slow. They're inefficient. And it made things very much worse in the end.
There's this quote by a guy named Hassan Isabah, and he founded uh, a secret assassin order known as the Hashashin. And he said, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." And this is one of the hard truths, ironically, of this world. Um, so you'll have to use morality as a tool, but it's going to have to be a tool for, I mean, it can be misused for a lot of things like selfish desire, political gain. But morality should be a tool that's used for harmony and order and restoring light to the from the dark.
That quote is really interesting because it came from the real order of assassins. And you had told me this before. I didn't know that the assassins were a real thing, and I freaked
Yeah.
out. I'm like, whoa, what? Widely known as the Hashashin,
Oh
or
yeah,
the
the
Order
Order of
of
Assassins.
Assassins.
Where's Assassin's
The
Creed?
actual
Yeah, the
assassins?
actual assassins of Assassin's
What?
Creed. Yeah,
What?
that's the guy I remember. Yeah, that's Altair.
What? I was just wondering yesterday, like, I wonder if the assassin. I know that the Templars are real. I wonder if the assassins are real too. What?
That was
That
a
was
crazy reveal. Yeah.
that was a crazy reveal. And I did more research into it. I figured out that quote, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted," applied to his order of assassins. They knew him as the Man of the Mountain, and they were pretty much outnumbered and trying to control a war against Islam. Well, that came what that was kind of an announcement that he made to his assassins, where he said that he had a revelation from Allah, and he said that the assassin, or Allah had said, supposedly to him, that the assassins do not need to uh, hold themselves to the standards of Islam to achieve their mission. And what ended up happening is that wars were very bloody during that time. You could throw masses of body. Well, what the assassins had done was that they had circumvented the rules and did something that the world saw as very dishonorable. But like, it's because nobles don't want to die. They don't want to feel vulnerable in their positions. Well, instead of throwing bodies at the situation because they were outnumbered, they would just go straight to the general, or they would go straight to their political enemies, and they would take them out. And in a weird way, this was to preserve life, because those same people would have started, not all of them, they were political enemies, but in the case where there's a story, they had left signature assassins hotcakes at a general's bed quarters to and a poisoned dagger. They hadn't killed him, but they let him know that they had been in his house or his quarters while he was leading a siege on a town, on a city that he was holding for a very long time. And this was their way of saying, like, we know where you are, we can reach you. You're never even going to see it coming. Well, that general lifted his siege because he got scared by that, and um, it saved a lot of lives. I mean, it stopped a siege against a city.
Yeah, and that's how these things can be used for their own positive political gains. I think there was the Yellow Turban Revolution that we talked about
Yeah,
in the apocalypse episode. Uh, that's an example of that.
it goes to show that when the pressure cooker goes long enough at a high enough temperature, if people don't have clearance from their ordained morality system or their own ordained religion to do what they need to do to exert their will, whether that's to subjugate others or to protect others, um, they will invent it instead. There will be some revelation that comes, and there will be some changing in the game that says, well, here's how it worked before, but now it works like this.
And for the majority of the population, it's going to be easier to be vicious rather than virtuous, which is why
Yes.
the majority typically don't want virtue or justice. They just want revenge and retribution.
Hmm. Well, I didn't want to get ahead of us here, but this is the basis of legalism in ancient China. Legalism, while still kind of a Taoist philosophy, kind of boils down to follow the law because I said so and I have an army. Um, it assumes that the worst traits in humanity are going to be the ones that surface first.
And legalism is probably, or legalism is one of the examples of a system that's trying to set in order really wrathfully the youthful contempt and hubris over morality that contributes to the cycles of the apocalypse. So like they have a point, they have reasons for what they do, but if
Mhm.
it's still suffocating, it's still gonna be like oppressing, you know?
Yeah, it was like their code of Hammurabi.
Right.
Like, the first justice systems we know were imperfect. Like, do what we say because we need to stop you from stealing stuff. So we're going to chop off your hands, we're going to cut off your head, we're going to slit your throat, we're going to kill your family. It's like,
Right.
those are very extreme. And you're right, they were suffocating. So the balancing act that legal systems play now is like, how do you enforce a morality that benefits as many people as possible and isn't suffocating to the point that they will reject it?
One of these excerpts from Republic Book 3,
Yeah.
it goes into falsehood, which is morality. And, that sounds weird, but I'll explain it later.
Sure.
Falsehood, though of no use to the gods, is useful to people as a form of drug. Clearly, we must allow only doctors to use it, not citizens. So this morality, or this falsehood rather, can be seen as morality in this sort of analogy. Um, but to kind of explain my meaning, I'll explain the basics of the myth of Ur. So the myth of Ur, E-R, just the myth of Ur, um, is at the very end of the Republic, and it's a completely made up myth that Plato writes or Socrates, talks about, that essentially says good people who do good things go to the good place after they die, and the bad people who do bad things go to the bad place when they die. And that was to like set the people who didn't understand anything about the form of the sun, the form of the good, the myth of the cave, the allegory, any of that, who didn't understand any of that, don't want to understand any of that, just listen to this myth.
So he made it up.
He made it up, yeah. But
Sure.
this does relate to Socrates being a monotheist, as we were talking about earlier, seeing the divine rationale as the holy source. And do you know about Akhenaten the autist? Autonist, I mean.
I do not explain what an autonist is.
Akhenaten the autist.
What did he do?
He's an Egyptian pharaoh.
I've heard the name. Yeah, I'm not familiar with his works.
Okay, so his name literally means effective for the Aten. Um, and Akhenaten was known as a henotheist, which means he is a monotheist. So he believes in one god, but he does not deny the existence of the other gods.
It was
Um,
very popular back then. Yeah.
he was known for Atenism, of course, and that was sun worship, or worshiping, I think it was like Ra Aten or Aten Ra.
Mm,
Um, so this sun worship is something that Socrates and Akhenaten both have in common, and
yeah.
mystics of all religions have come to realize this at some point. Crowley had that revelation written in one of his journals relating to the Hermetic principle of mentalism. You remember what that quote was?
I don't mentalism like.
Well, no, I mean
I'm not gonna say.
whenever Crowley mentioned that, like whenever Crowley had his revelation in his journals.
Oh, when he realized that everything was within.
Hmm.
Oh yeah, yeah. I know not. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's like one of the funniest things to me. He says like, "I know not how any magus can bear this revelation and continue on with their work." He was really torn up about it. He said the revelation came to him in like a split second, and then he was torn up about it for a long time.
Right. Did you want to say anything about any of that?
Well, people say that magic is the same as psychology, and I don't want to ruin the adventure for somebody else who wants to study these gods and to be in conversation with them. But the idea of mentalism, I'll propose it like this. The idea of mentalism is that all the angels, all of the gods, the holy guardian angel is all within the mind. It is like
It's all a
a
universal.
fraction.
The universe is a product of the mind of God. Yeah.
Yeah. And not only that, it's like it's not so reductive, but it's like it's all in your head. These are like portions of your psyche that you pour out into a space and isolate so that you can learn more about them. This doesn't mean that it's not real. And
Yeah,
it's like, okay,
there's gonna be, as soon as you said that, now there's gonna be a sudden outpour of questions like, why the hell do I need to learn about any of this in the first place? If none of this is real, why do I need to practice it?
right. And that is, well, I think this is why people need Eastern philosophy to accompany them along this journey because two things can be true at once. It's not that these things are useless. We're still doing something that is, by all measures, very unexplored territory because magic works like a force of gravity. It doesn't really need your permission to exist. And so it would be nonsensical to say that, well, demons are just in your head. They're not real. Okay, well, I invite you to try to, hold that attitude for the rest of your life and then encounter things that look like that. Like I challenge you to go and try to pretend that the forces of God are not at work in the world.
You know,
But
that just segues really nicely into angels, demons, and Solomonic magic, and
yeah,
just the neutrality of frameworks in general, if you wanted to talk about that.
yeah. So, well, I want to start this by saying that if you are coming to that revelation, or you are soon to come to that revelation, you're in good company because Akhenaten and Socrates had both come to this revelation. Aleister Crowley came to this revelation on his own. So if you believe in one creationary force and you still don't reject the existence of other kinds of beings, you're in good company. And I feel like I mean that in a modern sense as well. I think a lot of people are coming to this sensibility where to them it just doesn't make sense to deny old gods. Like somebody believed in it, um, probably for good reason. Well, angels, demons, and Solomonic magic. Um, I am a really stupid scholar for asking this question, but who was the one who created the archetypes? Was that Freud? The
Um,
psychological archetypes?
it was Jung.
You said that it was neutral ground. Okay. I invite you to think about the 72 demons of the Goetia, as well as the 72 angels of the Shem Hamefarash, or the Shem operation, which I'll talk about here in a minute. You can't get more neutral than psychology, right? Psychology is not concerned with anything but trying to explain why people behave the way that they do. How can it benefit them, or how do they use it to their own ends? Whether they those be good ends or bad.
You know, psychology, at least the like psychoanalytic sorts, have this. Man, I just lost my train of thought. Whoops.
Well, they've got a lot in common, and there are people who will roll their eyes when they hear that their system of magic is basically just psychology. That's not really what I'm saying. If anything, I'm saying that psychology is a lot like magic in this way.
Oh yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I remember I was going to say psychology is like a map, and
Yes,
magic incorporates maps for your soul.
because it's trying to divide the soul into different things that can be more easily understood in isolated uh, control.
Right.
So Jung had created psychological archetypes. In effect, while the approach to these things doesn't work exactly like it does in magic, it's really close because this is what Solomon was doing in his summoning circles. Those 72 demons of the Goetia, those are human archetypes. And, you know, I'm not necessarily saying that they don't exist out there in the world. If you were to ask me, in my opinion, yes, they certainly do.
I think
But you have,
they exist as a form of a polymathic construction of the self.
yeah, because somebody created that thought form, and that thought form has collected a lot of chi over time through people's studies and through people's fervent beliefs. This happens a lot, even in the world of theocracy or theology. There are things that don't have precedent that then gain precedent, kind of like the powers and principalities introduced in Catholicism. The Bible doesn't mention powers and principalities. They kind of made that up. Okay. Well, I don't want to veer off topic, but those, keep in mind, those kind of operate in the same way on a very large scale. The powers and principalities, that is. Well, if you wanted to isolate a certain part of your psyche that had to do with greed, there is a corresponding demon of greed, so you could better understand yourself.
Right, yeah,
Well,
that's a good example.
yeah, that's why they take the time to try to map out the idea of sin. There are seven deadly sins. That's why people are afraid of like speaking to that one thing. And I'm not like I don't engage with it not because um, it doesn't have my approval as a map, but because the Shem Hamefarash, rather than uh, map out 72 demons of the Goetia like Solomon did to know himself. There's a reason why they called him the wisest, because he spent a lot of time like trying to understand his subconscious through these beings. Well, recently there has been a rise in popularity for something called Shem Hemepharosh. I think that's what it's called, Shem Hemepharosh. I know it as a Shem operation. Instead of 72 demons, that is the literal, that is a map of the literal flip side of the coin. And I say this with such great emphasis because when I learned about this, I almost went all the way around the 72 demons of the Goetia, which probably at my point in development was not advisable. The Shem Hemepharosh lists 72 angels rather than demons, and the distinction in nature is very much different. Um, with demons, you do kind of risk dealing with more vampiric entities in nature, something that has no real problem. Like they represent something a little bit more primordial, something like a little bit more um, lizard brained. So it's a really good way of understanding the self. But angels can kind of achieve the same effect.
You know, it's kind of funny. I remember when you were like working with the demons and like that, and I was basically telling you like multiple times, like these things are like two sides to the same coin, right? And
Well, and I'm sorry I gave you so much friction there, but that was because I literally got confused and thought that the 72 Goetia were the only thing. It took me a while because the maps literally look exactly the same. In fact, we have a picture of it in our last thumbnail talking about the apocalypse.
yes,
You
and
can kind of
and
see,
you'll see it in this thumbnail as well. It'll be there too.
yeah, there's a picture of it, and I didn't know that there were literally two. So I was like trying to figure that out on its own terms. Um, and well, I messed up because I had not paid attention in class, and I didn't realize that the sham operation was standing all on its own as the flip side of the coin that's a little bit more benevolent.
No, you were missing class doing goetic rituals.
I actually wasn't. I didn't engage in that. They, you could
Right,
say that.
right.
No, you could say that the holy guardian angel had redirected me very quickly before I did
Okay,
that.
we could say that.
Yeah. And the difference between demons and angels. So anyone who tells you that angels will need like a sacrifice or need some energy from you in return, that's not true. That may have been a belief that existed, but like as we start distilling this information, we realize that some things should be our understanding of the angels, for example, should be refined because angels shouldn't need anything from you. They don't really need shit.
Yeah, but demons, on the other hand,
Yeah, demons are something a little bit more primordial. Uh, and I hesitate to say outwardly evil because that's a misunderstanding of what these
I think
fractions of the psyche
it might be
are.
more accurate to say they have more potential for manipulation than an angel would.
Yeah,
Angel has no potential for that.
yeah, because an angel doesn't need anything from you, but you know, a demon would have no problem teaching you the ins and outs of things like manipulation, power structure, how to achieve power, things of that nature. And like, okay, cool. Well, what would you rather embody? That or the thing that doesn't need to eat others in that way. The thing, would you rather embody something that does have to resort to those um, kinds of psychological tactics, or would you rather deal with entities that don't need anything from you and will teach you how to not need anything from others, whether they be your allies, your enemies, or just the people around you in life? You become what you eat when it comes to magic. What you summon will, in a very literal sense, become more prominent in your own personality. That's kind of the goal. So it's like, well, watch what you eat.
Right? The soul is dyed with the color of its thoughts.
Yeah. So it's up to you to decide what kind of entities you want to surround yourself with, what kind of attributes you want to take on for yourself.
Right. So we do have a couple more sections. We can do the east and west comparison.
Yep.
Okay, we can start off in the east, where morality is recognized um, as an abstract, man-made concept. Um, but this can be kind of misconstrued, and it definitely did get misconstrued in 1940s Japan, for instance. Um, it was D.T. Suzuki, apparently, who had used Buddhist, I believe it was Buddhist principles to support Japanese militarism against the Allied powers, which started Pearl Harbor.
Mm. Was there a quote that accompanied that?
Well, it wasn't really a quote, but I remember hearing about this from Slavoj Žižek.
Uh,
Do you know very much about Žižek?
I do not know.
Well, I'll send you the link where this is from, but
Maybe I'll
I
know his
remember
face.
I remember that he said that it was one of the worst things that he ever read was the uh, support like from Buddhism of Japanese militarism.
Oh yeah, yeah. The thing where they said like it's not so
And
much that I stabbed you; it's that my sword floated to your belly.
yeah, in this abstract dance of phenomena, we just, the
Yeah,
planes went into the harbor.
man. I don't think that's a very popular idea, is it? That's like, you know,
No, especially after Pearl Harbor.
goes to show that people will not just so easily accept corruption like that. You can have a little bit of faith. There are people who
Um,
think that way.
but that is one of the faults of the East, though. Like when you have no set order, like the West usually takes it to the extreme,
Hmm.
but it appears in this case the East takes it to the other extreme of there being no sense of morality and everything being a constant dance of phenomena in the universe, and so that means anything can happen and we can just do whatever we want. You need this is why you it's necessary to create some sort of moral order.
Right. Can I read the quote?
Go ahead if you want.
E.T. Suzuki, as a younger guy, he was fully supporting Japanese militarism, and one of his justifications was this: the advice to the Japanese military is to support Zen Buddhist training because, he says, it's one of the most horrifying things that I've ever read. He said that, let's say an officer orders me to kill you, stab you with a knife. He says, if I remain in this illusory self, then I feel responsible. I kill you. But he says if you're enlightened by Zen Buddhism, then you know there is no substantial reality. You become a neutral observer of your life, just a flow of phenomena. And you tell yourself, it's not that I'm killing you, but in the cosmic dance of phenomena, my knife is floating and somehow you fall into it. I'm not disputing some spiritual greatness of Zen Buddhism. I'm saying how even the most enlightened in the spiritual experience can serve a terrible cause.
Right.
Yeah, you know what that points to me, if you really do see your life, this is why Hermetics are so valuable. That kind of smacks of a sort of disassociation, which we knew that, soldiers struggled with during those times where they were seeing a lot of horrible and traumatic things. Um, well, I say the morality comes more from you don't see yourself as having no control over this cosmic dance of phenomena. You take accountability for your actions. You guide, like, if you're going to guide yourself, then guide yourself. Don't abstain from responsibility
Yeah,
for the things that you do and the ways that you behave.
and this has
That's in your
actually
control.
been something you've been recently researching and working on yourself, right? With the uh, development of the way and the strategy with Miyamoto
I have,
Musashi wrote
yeah,
about
strategy.
those things. Yes.
Strategy is very quickly becoming the central point of my own spiritual system because I find that it functions very similar to Hermetics, but reconciles more adequately the will to power. Um, with less emphasis on science and more an emphasis on exploring your world to truly appreciate it. And it's not like you're not conscious. The entire exercise is to be absolutely conscious. And so it's a dance of swordplay. If this guy is one end of the spectrum, Musashi, who dueled and killed 62 men, I believe, well, he's the other end. He was fully conscious. He was fully awake. He knew what he was doing. And he instructs when you cut an enemy, follow through with the cut. He even tells you the specifics of how to put yourself in that mentality. But then he says, you have to take responsibility for your actions. And that's how you really become a more effective warrior and a more effective swordsman in that way, is by knowing what you do and making it intentional. Not any of this nonsense about like, we're just in a cosmic dance of phenomena, bro. We're not even really doing anything. I'm not really stabbing you.
The
No.
universe, it's itself experiencing itself, man, and we can do whatever we want.
Yeah. And it's like the point with strategy is like, all right, if I'm stabbing you, then I'm really fucking stabbing you. And I'm going to accept the consequences and responsibility of that. And I'm also going to do my best to get better at it so that the next guy who tries to come and stab me can't do it as well as I can.
We went from one extreme uh, of the East, one of the faults of the East. We've been talking up the East for a little bit, so we're going to talk about
Yeah.
the negatives.
Time to cut them a little bit.
And time to stop bashing the West as hard as
Yeah.
we've been doing.
Yeah, I feel bad about that sometimes because I'm trying to do honor and
Yeah, there.
respect to every tradition, but I
That's
have to
the
point out
thing.
the flaws.
That's the thing. There are good and bad things to take away from not only both of these traditions, but like all of the traditions.
Yeah, eat the meat and spit out the bones. Well, we wanted to end by saying morality is an abstract thing, but useful for attaining gnosis. Is
Well,
that
yeah,
accurate?
that is true. But before we get to that, let's just address one of the more. I mean, I don't know how positive this really is, but it's certainly one of the characteristics of the Western perspective, and that is taking yourself up to be a guardian angel in the
Mm,
army of Christ, being reborn in his name.
yeah, and yeah, it's not like everybody who gets baptized like takes on this mentality, but I think it's becoming more popular lately to become a sort of extremist for your own religion, giving all the religious conflicts that are happening right now across the world. Everybody is fervently trying to find something to believe in.
Yeah, we got stuff like Christian nationalism. and things like
Mm,
that on the rise, and we got obviously the war in Israel that happened this year.
yeah. You've got influencers converting to Islam and then preaching it a
You
lot.
also got a lot of younger people who apparently agreed with uh, Bin Laden in his letter to America.
Yeah. The ideological wars are getting a little bit crazy right now. And yeah,
Culture
the
wars
pressure
are
cooking is cooking.
culture wars are, starting to have real consequences. I was thinking about that earlier
Yeah.
myself. But
Well,
the Crusades had a permanent influence on zealous and egotistic Christians, though, who felt like they have to, the ones who have to, who feel like they have to defend their religion by destroying all of the other ones.
mm,
This is like classic tribalism, and especially during the Crusades, where they
yeah,
settled in like indigenous lands and then like purged those lands of any outside culture and like
had to do that under some kind of guise. If you want to follow through with crimes, you got to find some
but
ideological thing to attach it to convince people to give
this
will to power to you.
this shouldn't take away the nuance from it though. The Crusaders did build many cities and they did settle there. They did do that to Christianize the population and secure the lands they traveled to, but they provided for their own.
Yeah, they did. Islam did something very similar. So, like, we live in a time that's very um, advanced thanks to scholars of religious descent. You know, would it have happened either way? I don't know. Maybe they did it in Africa before anybody ever thought to go colonize Africa. They had developed arithmetic and other kinds of sciences, but some of your greatest minds in science do come from religious backgrounds. Well, what you were talking about before with so according to Nietzsche, God is dead, and we have to find something to replace him with. Well, you're finding a strange, well, not strange. It's very much a natural reaction. You're finding people who will return to religious dogma because they have to find somewhere to channel like their will to do good. Um, I want to preface this by saying, well, in magic, you don't deny the existence of God at all. In fact, God serves a very central purpose in helping you to attain knowledge about these things. Um, they call it, we call it, knowledge and conversation with the HGA. And that's just another way of saying that we are praying and talking to God, learning things that we probably would not have known or had any other way to know otherwise. Um, I can say with relative confidence, God is not going to teach you to put your energy into these things. He's not going to teach you to throw your life away, whether literally or figuratively, by going into a constant crusade with other ideologies because you feel like your ideology is in danger. That's a reaction made out of fear. Um, they feel on a subconscious level that their way of life is in danger, that it can be taken down. They say this all the time. The West is being threatened by a lack of
And
religiousness, like
well,
they are taking
during the Dark
religion
Ages,
out.
it definitely was a real cause to rally under.
It was, and it's still a real cause to rally under now because, well, to a lot of people, it's it gives them a sort of purpose.
Oh,
But
definitely, yeah. That's why people join like extremist groups in general.
yeah, and it's not particularly. I don't want to say it's not productive because things still happen because of you when you do that. But um, there's a difference between operating under faith and believing that faith is in danger. So you constantly feel like you have to go out and you have to fight the enemy that is threatening your way of life and your faith and the way that you do things so that you can preserve it. But, well, I offer a solution to speak to God in a way that gives you a sense of faith, which is not threatened by outsiders or by authority that would punish you for doing the right thing.
Well, there's also a sense of security that you would have to develop within your own faith.
Well, that's ultimately why it's a self improvement process, too. That's why they tell you to know thyself. It's because you can't do anything before you do that. You'll buckle under the pressure. It's still very much a worthy cause to give yourself to. It's just the way that God speaks is a lot
Well,
different
yeah,
from.
I think you need to develop the security within yourself to then develop the security within the faith, if that's what you're going to
Mhm.
do.
Yeah, and it can happen hand in hand,
And
but the way
I think
that
it normally does.
it normally does, it did for me. But I think the way that God speaks to people who are really, really listening to him, as in learning about things that they wouldn't have known about before, like something that has some real oomph, he speaks a lot differently than a lot of people think that he does. And it really just comes from maybe you shouldn't talk so much, maybe you should listen. Maybe you should take suggestions from him. Anything that happens like conflict or war, that's entirely your making. God
Right.
didn't do that. So we said that morality is an abstract thing, but it can be guided by a central force.
Yeah,
It's
and
useful for gnosis.
let's conclude now. And you already did say morality is an abstract concept, very useful
Mm,
for cultivating gnosis.
yeah,
And
and well,
just for anybody who might be wondering, what is gnosis? Well, that's the understanding of God and the process of divinity.
yeah, and people describe this as surrendering to the divine. We would probably describe it as achieving knowledge and conversation with the HGA, like the moment that you start speaking to the holy guardian angel. Um, the theme for that, I think that's just another way. I think surrendering in that way is another way of saying that you are admitting ignorance. You don't start by thinking that you have read a certain book and that now you have all of the answers, even though those words have been translated and mistranslated a bunch of times over. Um, you start by getting the knowledge from the source directly, and that happens the moment that you say, well, maybe I don't know anything. Maybe I know nothing. So teach me from scratch.
Right. Cultivating gnosis, to me, it can be seen as um, erecting the rails on the stairway to heaven. You don't need to stop fighting your enemies if you have them or if they attack you, but understand where those enemies are coming from. Why are they attacking you, and what in what context? Even if you don't understand rationally rather than emotionally, or emotionally rather than rationally, once you let morality go, in a weird way, it bounces back to you.
I would describe this as thinking strategically. Like, you don't have to sympathize with your enemies, you just have to understand why they're doing the things that they do. And, maybe ask yourself why you have enemies. that's that's
Yeah,
another good
and like,
question.
what's the behavior that's causing you to have enemies, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave off then, unless
All
you have
right.
anything else to say.
Do you want to cap this off with an outro or anything?
If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. I am Silas.
And I'm joyous.
thank you for listening and giving your attention to Hermetic Link.